The diesel engine ticked in the darkness, cooling after hours of convoy movement. Major Rashid al-Takriti checked his watch, 0245, March 24, 2003, and allowed himself a cautious exhale. His armored column, 12 T-72 tanks, and 16 support vehicles of the Republican Guard's Medina Division had made it through another night. In 4 hours, dawn would come. American planes would circle like vultures, and the hiding would begin again. But for now, in the pre-dawn blackness south of Karbala, they were invisible. He had no idea he was already dead. The story of how Iraqi commanders discovered that darkness had become their enemy, not their ally, would reshape modern warfare and shatter assumptions that had held since the first tank rolled across a moonlit battlefield. What happened in the nights between March 19th and April 9th, 2003, wasn't just a military defeat. It was a technological revelation that turned the oldest tactical advantage in history into a death trap. March 19th, 2003, 0130 Baghdad time. The sound came first, a distant, rhythmic thunder like a storm approaching across the desert. Then the horizon flickered orange. Then the ground shook. Roughly 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles, each one carrying 1,000 pounds of high explosive and a GPS guidance system accurate to within 10 feet, were slamming into command bunkers, communications towers, and early warning radar installations across Baghdad. The shock and awe campaign had begun, and it had deliberately chosen the cover of darkness. Inside a bunker beneath the Ministry of Defense, Brigadier General Hassan al-Obaidi watched his secure phone lines go dead one by one. The rumble of distant impacts felt like a giant's footsteps approaching. He had fought in the Iran-Iraq War. He had survived the 1991 Gulf War. He knew American air power was formidable in daylight. But this systematic destruction in total darkness, each strike landing exactly where it needed to, this was something new. "They can't see at night better than we can," his deputy insisted, gripping a situation map that no longer matched reality. "No one can." The deputy was wrong. In the skies above, American pilots wearing night vision goggles saw the world as a flat emerald plain. The green phosphor glow reduced depth perception, turned dust into what looked like solid walls, and made bright lights flare like supernovas. But it allowed them to fly, fight, and designate targets in complete darkness. One pilot later described it. "You train until you trust green glass. In combat, it's like flying through a different world. Shadows are deeper, lights flare, and a small mistake can be fatal." Iraqi commanders who had survived 1991 expected harassment raids at night. A few missiles here, some scattered bombing there, enough to keep soldiers awake and afraid, but nothing systematic. They planned accordingly. Move at night, hide at dawn, use darkness to reposition forces, resupply forward units, shift armor away from American sensors. It was the same logic that had protected armies since warfare began. Night conceals movement. Daylight exposes it. They were fighting the last war. The technology that would destroy their doctrine had been refined over 12 years. Night vision goggles had evolved from bulky, unreliable equipment into standard issue for pilots and ground forces. Forward-looking infrared sensors, FLIR, could detect the heat signature of an idling tank engine from miles away. The Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM, married GPS guidance to dumb bombs, allowing aircraft to release weapons from high altitude or far back from targets and strike within feet of designated coordinates. The GBU-31 family alone, 2,000-pound GPS-guided bombs, would account for thousands of strikes during the campaign. But the real revolution wasn't any single technology. It was the integration of all of them into a system that made darkness transparent. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, formed the foundation. Predator drones loitered unseen at altitude, their cameras tracking vehicle movements in real time. J-STAR's radar aircraft mapped the ground below, detecting moving vehicles even through clouds and smoke. Signals intelligence intercepted cell phone calls and unsecured radio chatter. Iraqi convoy commanders checking in with headquarters. Maintenance crews reporting breakdowns. Supply officers coordinating fuel deliveries. Each intercepted signal became a coordinate. Each coordinate became a target. Then came the strikes, timed for the pre-dawn hours when crews were least alert and when the thermal contrast between cooling vehicle engines and cold ground made detection easiest. Major al-Takriti's column south of Karbala had been marked 6 hours earlier. A Predator drone had spotted the movement. J-STARS confirmed vehicle count and direction. An intercepted cell phone call. A tank commander checking in with his wife in Baghdad, telling her he was safe, they were moving under cover of darkness, provided confirmation. The coordinates were uploaded to mission planners aboard carriers in the Persian Gulf. At 0315, an F-15E Strike Eagle released a GBU-31 from 32,000 feet and 12 miles away. The pilot couldn't see the target with his own eyes, didn't need to. The bomb carried GPS coordinates. It would find its own way. The weapon took 90 seconds to fall. In that time, Major al-Takriti stepped out of his command vehicle to stretch. He lit a cigarette, a small luxury, dangerous in daylight when the smoke could draw attention, but safe enough in darkness, this complete. The stars overhead were brilliant. No moon, no ambient light for hundreds of miles. Perfect conditions for movement. The weapon struck the lead fuel tanker. The fireball rose 30 meters, turned night into noon for 5 seconds, and ignited a cascade of secondary explosions as ammunition in nearby vehicles cooked off. The acrid smell of burning diesel mixed with melting rubber and scorched metal. The heat was so intense that men 200 meters away felt their faces flush. The sound, a thunderclap followed by a rolling, tearing roar, echoed across the desert for miles. Darkness was no longer sanctuary. 12 minutes later, a second strike, then a third. By 0400, what had been a functioning armored column was a line of burning wreckage visible from space. And across Iraq, the same scene was repeating. Convoys caught on open roads, tank formations clustered for night movement, supply depots where maintenance crews worked by dim torchlight, bridging equipment staged for river crossings, command vehicles with their distinctive antenna arrays, all of them visible through the darkness, all of them vulnerable. Iraqi officers had prepared for American technological superiority in daylight. They had planned to use darkness to level the playing field, to move and fight when American sensors were blind. But American sensors were never blind. And in the nights that followed, Iraqi commanders would discover that every assumption they held about modern warfare had become obsolete. The tanks, the training, the courage of their soldiers, none of it mattered when the enemy could see through the dark and strike with precision from miles away. The question wasn't whether Iraq could win. The question was whether Iraqi forces could survive until dawn. Before we continue this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if you're finding this deep dive into modern warfare fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe. This story gets even more intense. The first sound the Iraqi tank crew heard was the rotors, a distant, rhythmic thump, thump, thump growing louder, but from which direction they couldn't tell. Lieutenant Karim Hassan pressed himself against the side of his T-72, trying to locate the source in the darkness. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then the sky split open with tracer fire, and he understood. The Americans had brought helicopters into the deep night, and his entire formation was being hunted from above. This was warfare his training hadn't prepared him for, a battlefield where the enemy could see, and he could not. March 24th, 2003, 0300 hours, the Karbala Gap. The Republican Guard's Medina Division had positioned itself along the southern approaches to Baghdad, dug in across a natural choke point where highways converged between the Euphrates River and a lake. On paper, it was a killing ground. Any American advance would have to funnel through, exposing armor to entrenched positions. Iraqi planners had studied Stalingrad, studied Kursk. They knew how to defend urban approaches. But they had never faced an enemy that owned the night. The AH-64 Apache longbow helicopters arrived in darkness so complete that pilots described it as flying through ink. Their forward-looking infrared sensors painted the world in shades of white-hot and cold black. Tank hulls glowed like coals. Idling engines blazed like beacons. Human bodies showed as pale gray shapes against cooler earth. The longbow radar, mounted above the rotor, could detect and classify vehicles through dust, smoke, and darkness, up to 256 targets simultaneously. The Iraqi defenders, arranged in defensive positions that assumed visual contact, had made themselves perfect targets. Captain James Mitchell, piloting an Apache in the Deep Strike package, later described what he saw through his helmet-mounted display. The FLIR showed them clear as day. Tanks in revetments, vehicles clustered near buildings, maintenance crews working on tracks. They thought darkness was concealment. To us, they were lit up like Christmas trees. The Apaches carried Hellfire missiles, laser-guided weapons designed to penetrate tank armor. Each helicopter could carry 16. The missiles could be fired from miles away, guided to target by invisible laser beams that only the Americans could see. The Iraqi crews would hear the rotor noise, might glimpse a dark shape in the sky, but by the time they oriented their guns, the missiles were already inbound. The first Hellfire struck a command vehicle at 0315. The explosion tore through thin armor, ignited ammunition inside, and sent a fireball 20 feet high. Secondary explosions followed as nearby vehicles caught fire. The orange glow briefly illuminated the battlefield and revealed to the Iraqi defenders just how exposed they were. Lieutenant Hassan watched 3 of his company's tanks explode in 90 seconds. The attackers were invisible. The missiles came without warning. Radio discipline collapsed as panicked voices flooded the net. "Where are they? I can't see anything." "We're taking fire from the north. No, the west, I don't know." One officer tried to rally his men by pointing his searchlight skyward, hoping to blind the attackers, or at least illuminate them for anti-aircraft guns. The beam stabbed into blackness for 3 seconds before a Hellfire missile rode it back to its source. The explosion killed the crew instantly and taught every other Iraqi soldier a lethal lesson. Light reveals you first. Technology had inverted the rules, but the Apache raid on the Karbala Gap revealed something else, that American dominance wasn't absolute. That night operations carried risks even for the technologically superior force. On March 23rd, one AH-64 Apache, call sign Kentucky 10, flew too low over an Iraqi position. Ground fire, small arms, machine guns, the desperate volume fire of soldiers who couldn't see their target but could hear the rotors, found the helicopter. Rounds punctured hydraulic lines, shattered instrument panels, damaged the tail rotor. The pilots, Chief Warrant Officers David Williams and Ronald Young, fought to keep the aircraft airborne, but were forced to make an emergency landing in a field near Karbala. They were captured within hours. Iraqi television broadcast footage of the two American pilots on March 25th. Bruised, clearly frightened, surrounded by armed guards. Baghdad's propaganda machine trumpeted the capture. Proof that American technology could be defeated, that the occupation would fail, that resistance was possible. The images were broadcast across the Arab world, a rare propaganda victory for a regime that was losing badly. The Apache crash revealed a critical vulnerability. Night vision technology made pilots powerful but not invincible. The green glow of night vision goggles flattened the world, eliminated depth perception, turned three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional plane. Pilots described flying through green murk, where bright lights flare and dust looks like a solid wall. Brownout conditions, dust kicked up by rotor wash in the desert, became navigation nightmares. Several non-combat helicopter accidents during the campaign were attributed directly to NVG-related disorientation. Coalition commanders adjusted tactics. Deep helicopter strikes continued, but with more caution, more support, more attention to the limits of their technology. The night still belonged to American forces, but it was a contested dominion, bought with training, discipline, and the occasional sacrifice. For Iraqi commanders watching from bunkers and command posts, the lesson was more brutal. Even when American technology failed, it failed forward. One captured helicopter, 2 pilots. Meanwhile, entire Iraqi formations were being systematically destroyed every night. The targeting wasn't random. American planners had identified the critical nodes of Iraqi military power, not just the tanks and artillery, but the logistics network that kept them mobile. Fuel tankers became priority targets. A destroyed fuel truck could immobilize a dozen tanks. Maintenance vehicles, flatbed transporters carrying spare parts, mobile repair workshops, all were struck in pre-dawn windows when crews were exhausted and vulnerable. Senior Lieutenant Ahmed Al-Duri, a logistics officer with the 3rd Armored Division, experienced the transformation firsthand. His convoy of 16 fuel tankers and 8 maintenance trucks moved at night through open desert, dispersed over 2 kilometers to minimize loss if attacked. Standard doctrine, smart tactics, it didn't matter. At 0420 on March 26th, an AC-130 gunship orbiting at 12,000 feet detected the convoy's heat signatures through infrared sensors. The crew, combining FLIR imagery, night vision spotters, and laser designators, could see individual vehicles, could distinguish tankers from trucks, could even observe men dismounting to check tire pressure. The AC-130's 40mm cannon spoke first, a long, grinding roar audible for miles, and walked a line of destruction through the convoy. Then the 105mm howitzer engaged, each round guided by laser. The fuel tankers erupted one after another, fireballs climbing into the night sky, burning diesel spreading across sand. Al-Duri survived by diving into a ditch and covering himself with a tarp. He lay there for 3 hours, listening to the methodical destruction, smelling burning rubber and scorched metal, feeling the heat from fires 200 meters away. When dawn came, his entire convoy was gone, 24 vehicles reduced to smoking chassis. "They could see us," he said in a post-war interview, "and we could see nothing." How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? Iraqi forces tried to adapt, Some units dispersed individual vehicles under trees, behind buildings, in orchards, hoping to break up the thermal signature. Some covered tanks with wet blankets, trying to mask heat. Some shut down engines hours before dawn, accepting cold starts and mechanical strain to reduce infrared visibility. Nothing worked consistently. Modern thermal sensors could detect the residual heat from an engine that had been off for hours. Wet blankets dried in the desert air. Dispersion just meant vehicles were destroyed individually instead of in groups. The psychological toll mounted. Iraqi soldiers began to fear darkness more than daylight. At least in daylight you could see the planes coming, could track the bombs falling, could shoot back at something. Night brought invisible death. You heard the jets at altitude, heard the whistle of falling ordnance, felt the ground shake, and never saw the weapon that killed you. Major Walid Hassan, a battalion commander outside Basra, kept a journal that was recovered after the war. March 27th, lost 6 vehicles last night. No warning. Men are afraid to sleep. Some refuse to move at night. I cannot blame them. We are fighting ghosts. But the Americans weren't ghosts. They were men flying machines, using technology to bend the oldest law of warfare. That night protects both sides equally. And every night, as Iraqi commanders watched their formations erode, they understood that they weren't just losing battles. They were losing the assumption that modern warfare required equals on both sides. The bread queue stretched 4 blocks through the Karada district of Baghdad. Fatima al-Mansour had been standing for 3 hours in late March heat that climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, waiting for the government distribution that might or might not arrive. Around her, other women fanned themselves with newspapers, shifted weight from foot to foot, and watched the sky. Not for rain, there would be no rain, but for the contrails of aircraft that might signal another strike, another night of explosions that shook windows and sent children crying into their mothers' arms. The war had come to the civilian population not through ground combat, but through the systematic erasure of normality. One failed power grid, one empty bakery, one sleepless night at a time. By late March 2003, Baghdad and Basra had descended into a rhythm of deprivation. Electricity failed for hours, sometimes days, in neighborhoods across both cities. Water distribution networks, damaged by strikes on pumping stations or preemptively shut down to prevent contamination, left entire districts without clean water. Families stored water in basement cisterns, boiled river water when supplies failed, and queued for rations that shrank daily as the logistics network collapsed. The temperature multiplied the suffering. March and April in Baghdad regularly saw temperatures climb into the 90s and low hundreds Fahrenheit, 32 to 43 degrees Celsius. Without reliable power, fans stopped turning. Air conditioning became a memory. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, making sleep difficult even when the bombing paused. Fatima's husband, a civil engineer named Omar, had tried to explain what was happening. They're not just bombing military targets. They're breaking the connections. Power plants supply water pumps. Water treatment needs electricity. Food distribution requires fuel for trucks. They break one link, and 10 others fail. She understood the logic. She also understood that logic didn't help when her children were thirsty. At night, the city transformed. Blackout conditions meant no street lights, no shop illumination, no ambient glow from a million windows. Baghdad became a medieval city under a modern war. Dark, silent except for the call to prayer from mosques at dawn and dusk, punctuated by distant explosions and the occasional crack of anti-aircraft fire that never seemed to hit anything. Families tried to maintain ritual despite chaos. Mosques still called the faithful to prayer 5 times daily, the cadence of religious observance providing structure to days that had lost all other predictability. Some families attempted to keep normal meal times, though meals had become sparse. Rice and flatbread, sometimes lentils, rarely meat. Entertainment meant battery-powered radios when batteries could be found, conversation by candlelight when they couldn't. One resident described the sensory landscape to a journalist. You wake to the smell of diesel smoke from generators. You taste dust in everything you eat. You hear explosions so distant you can't tell if they're thunder or bombs. And at night, total darkness, except when the sky lights up orange, and then you count seconds until the sound arrives. War had become an assault on the senses before it touched the body. But the real collapse was happening outside the cities, on the roads and in the killing grounds, where Iraqi military formations were learning that every tactical assumption they held had become obsolete. Republican Guard commanders had positioned their elite units, the Medina Division, the Hammurabi Division, the Baghdad Division, along approaches to the capital. These were Iraq's best-trained, best-equipped formations, veterans of 8 years fighting Iran and the 1991 Gulf War. They had Soviet-era T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, and anti-aircraft systems. On paper, they could contest an American advance. On paper meant nothing when paper couldn't account for thermal sensors. The T-72 tanks that formed the backbone of Iraqi armor were designed in the 1970s with thin thermal insulation. Adequate for the Cold War European theater, inadequate against modern forward-looking infrared systems. The engines, running or recently shut down, glowed white-hot in FLIR displays. The exhaust systems remained visible for hours after shutdown. Even the crew compartments, warmed by body heat, showed as pale signatures against cooler steel. Iraqi crews tried improvised countermeasures. Some draped tanks with blankets soaked in water, hoping moisture would mask heat. In the desert air, the blankets dried within hours. Some parked vehicles under trees or beside buildings, using structures to break up thermal outlines. American sensors could still detect the heat differential. Some shut down engines at dusk and accepted cold starts at dawn. Hard on machinery, hard on batteries, and ultimately futile because residual engine heat remained detectable. Brigadier General Majid al-Dulaimi, commanding an armored brigade south of Baghdad, documented his unit's disintegration in reports that were found after the war. March 27th. Lost 4 tanks, 3 BMPs, 2 fuel trucks in pre-dawn strike. No warning, no contact with enemy ground forces. March 29th. Battalion strength down to 60%. Men refuse to sleep near vehicles. Maintenance impossible. Crews fear working with lights. March 31st. Cannot maneuver at night. Cannot hide in day. We are being erased. The mathematics of survival had become impossible. American strike packages followed a deliberate pattern, refined over 12 years since the 1991 Gulf War. Suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD missions, went in first, hours before the main strike. Small, targeted attacks on radar installations, SA-6 surface-to-air missile sites, and S-60 anti-aircraft positions. These strikes were surgical. A single JDAM on a radar van, a cluster munition on a missile battery, designed to blind the defense network without alerting the main target. Then came the ISR package. Predator drones, J-STARS radar aircraft, and signals intelligence assets that built a real-time picture of enemy positions. The intelligence fusion was what made the system lethal, not just seeing targets, but understanding them. A J-STARS radar return showed vehicles moving. A Predator camera identified them as tanks or trucks. An intercepted cell phone call, a convoy commander reporting his position to headquarters, a maintenance officer calling for spare parts, a soldier phoning home, provided confirmation and exact coordinates. Iraqi officers betrayed their own positions constantly. Military radios were often unsecured. Cell phone usage, common among officers who had grown accustomed to commercial networks, turned every call into a targeting beacon. One intercepted conversation from March 28th. "We are 5 kilometers south of the bridge, moving to new positions." 30 minutes later, a GPS-guided bomb struck the convoy. The strikes themselves followed a logic that maximized disruption. Planners deliberately targeted logistics vehicles, fuel tankers, maintenance trucks, bridging equipment, because destroying mobility was more efficient than destroying every tank. A formation without fuel was immobilized. A unit without spare parts couldn't repair battle damage. An armored brigade without bridge layers couldn't cross rivers. One destroyed fuel tanker could halt an entire column. The fireball from burning diesel, 10 to 30 meters high, spreading flaming fuel across roadways, created obstacles that couldn't be bypassed. The heat cooked ammunition in nearby vehicles, triggering secondary explosions that spread destruction exponentially. The smoke, black and acrid, marked positions for follow-up strikes. Captain Ali Rashid, an Iraqi armor officer, survived one such attack. "We were moving at night, dispersed, following protocol. The lead fuel truck exploded, just exploded, no warning. The fire spread to 2 more tankers. We abandoned vehicles and ran. In the morning, I counted. 11 vehicles destroyed, 7 damaged, 42 men dead or missing. 1 bomb. 1. By early April, entire Iraqi Corps had lost the ability to maneuver. 3rd Corps, positioned south of Baghdad, reported supply shortages that made operations impossible. 5th Corps, defending the approaches from the west, abandoned equipment for lack of fuel. Republican Guard divisions, once the regime's most reliable forces, fragmented as units lost communication, logistics, and command cohesion. The defeat wasn't happening in pitched battles. It was happening in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when bombs fell without warning and formations dissolved without ever engaging the enemy. A Rand Corporation analysis later concluded what Iraqi officers had learned through bitter experience. Air power, when combined with pervasive sensors and precision guidance, could neutralize maneuver space entirely. Traditional military tactics, concentration of forces, defensive positions, night movement, became liabilities. The assumptions that had governed warfare for a century had been overturned by technology that made concealment impossible and precision inevitable. The battlefield had become transparent. What would you do? If you commanded a force that couldn't move without being tracked, couldn't hide without being seen, couldn't fight without being destroyed from beyond visual range, what options remain? Surrender, disperse, fight anyway, knowing each night erodes your strength. Iraqi officers faced this calculus daily. Some chose surrender, abandoning positions and walking toward American lines with white flags. Some chose dispersal, breaking units into small groups that might escape detection. Some chose defiance, maintaining positions and accepting the mathematical certainty of destruction. By April 5, 2003, as American forces closed on Baghdad, the question was no longer whether Iraqi resistance would collapse, but whether it had already ceased to exist as an organized force. The tanks were still there, the soldiers still willing, but the connective tissue, the fuel, the communications, the logistics, the confidence, had been systematically destroyed. Night after night, strike after strike, until darkness itself became the enemy. April 9th, 2003, 0800 hours, Firdos Square, central Baghdad. The statue of Saddam Hussein still stood on its concrete pedestal, arm raised in eternal salute, surrounded by a city that had ceased to resist. Major Rashid al-Tikriti, the same officer who had believed darkness would protect his column 2 weeks earlier, walked through streets littered with abandoned uniforms, discarded weapons, and burned-out vehicles. He wore civilian clothes now. The Republican Guard no longer existed as a fighting force. The war was over, and he had survived to witness the aftermath of a technological revolution he still didn't fully comprehend. The defeat hadn't come through superior courage or numbers. It had come through the systematic destruction of every assumption Iraqi commanders held about modern warfare. The final days of resistance had dissolved not in dramatic last stands, but in quiet capitulation. Officers walking away from positions, soldiers discarding uniforms, entire formations simply ceasing to exist. By April 5th, American forces had reached Baghdad's outskirts without encountering the apocalyptic urban battle Iraqi planners had predicted. By April 7th, American tanks were rolling through government districts. By April 9th, the regime had collapsed. What remained were questions, wreckage, and the stunned silence of soldiers who had been defeated by an enemy they rarely saw. In the weeks and months following the invasion, as American forces established control and began interviewing captured officers, a pattern emerged in the testimonies. Iraqi commanders hadn't been outfought in traditional terms. They had been made obsolete. The technological gap wasn't measured in increments of improvement, but in paradigm shifts that rendered Iraqi doctrine irrelevant. Colonel Hassan al-Amiri, former commander of an armored brigade, spoke to American intelligence officers in May 2003. "We expected Americans to be strong in daylight. We planned for that. We trained for that. What we encountered was something else entirely. An enemy that could see through darkness, strike from beyond visual range, and coordinate attacks with precision we couldn't match even in perfect conditions. We weren't fighting a superior army. We were fighting a different century." The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. By late April, analysts tallied the campaign's technological deployment. Thousands of GPS-guided weapons dropped. Several thousand JDAM kits used with the GBU-31 family of 2,000-pound bombs, accounting for the largest single share. Coalition aircraft had flown tens of thousands of sorties, the vast majority at night or in pre-dawn hours. The targeting had been so precise that entire formations were neutralized, without conventional ground engagements. Iraqi armored losses were catastrophic, not from tank versus tank battles, but from systematic interdiction. Fuel supplies destroyed before they reached the front. Maintenance depots struck before repairs could be completed. Command vehicles eliminated before orders could be distributed. The Iraqi military hadn't been defeated so much as it had been dismantled, piece by piece in the darkness. Warfare had been transformed while the world watched. The psychological impact on Iraqi officers who survived was profound. They had been trained in Soviet doctrine, had studied the great tank battles of World War II, had believed that courage, tactical skill, and defensive positions could offset technological advantages. The 2003 invasion taught them that technological superiority, when absolute enough, rendered traditional military virtues insufficient. Brigadier General Majid al-Dulaimi, whose reports documented his brigade's disintegration, reflected in a post-war interview, "My men were brave. Our positions were sound. Our tactics were correct for the war we expected to fight, but we were fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. They knew where we were before we moved. They struck before we could react. They destroyed our supplies before we could use them. How do you counter that? You can't. You surrender or you die. The technological lessons extended beyond night vision and precision weapons. The integration of systems, ISR feeding real-time intelligence to strike aircraft, GPS guidance allowing weapons release from safe distances, thermal sensors making concealment impossible, created a battlefield where information dominance translated directly to combat dominance. One Iraqi officer, speaking anonymously to researchers years later, described the moment he understood the war was unwinnable. It was March 28th. We lost 3 convoys in one night. Different locations, different routes, all destroyed within a 4-hour window. The Americans had to be everywhere, seeing everything. That's when I knew. They weren't just better equipped. They had changed what war meant. The civilian population, which had endured weeks of infrastructure collapse, food, shortages, and nighttime bombardment, faced a different kind of aftermath. The war's end brought relief from nightly explosions, but introduced new uncertainties. Occupation, political vacuum, the slow, grinding work of reconstruction. Fatima al-Mansour, who had waited in breadlines during the bombing, found herself waiting in different lines for different rations under different authority. The war hadn't just defeated Iraq's military. It had demonstrated to the world what modern warfare looked like when one side possessed generational technological advantages. Other nations watched and drew conclusions. China accelerated its own night vision and precision guidance programs. Russia began developing countermeasures to GPS-guided weapons. Smaller nations understood that conventional military resistance against peer technological powers had become suicidal. The American military, meanwhile, had validated a doctrine of network-centric warfare, where sensors, communications, and precision weapons formed an integrated system that could dominate battlefields without massive troop deployments. The invasion used fewer ground forces than the 1991 Gulf War, but achieved faster, more complete results. The lesson seemed clear. Technology could substitute for mass. But the invasion also revealed limits. The Apache helicopter raid on Karbala that ended with 2 pilots captured showed the technological superiority wasn't invincibility. The brownout accidents, the navigation challenges with night vision goggles, the vulnerability of aircraft to ground fire, all demonstrated that even advanced systems faced constraints. More profoundly, the military victory didn't translate to political success. The Iraqi military was defeated in 3 weeks. The occupation that followed would last years, complicated by insurgency, sectarian conflict, and the discovery that precision weapons couldn't solve political problems. The technology that made conventional victory easy had no answers for the challenges that came after. Dominance in one domain didn't guarantee success in all domains. For the Iraqi officers who experienced the campaign, the lasting impact wasn't shame at defeat, but awe at the technological chasm. Many would later describe feeling they had fought not another nation, but a glimpse of the future. A military so advanced that their own capabilities seemed antiquated by comparison. Oberst Lieutenant Ahmed al-Duri, the logistics officer who survived the AC-130 attack on his convoy, immigrated to Jordan after the war. In a 2010 interview, he reflected, "I served in the military for 18 years. I thought I understood modern warfare. The 2003 invasion taught me I understood nothing. We were using 1970s technology against weapon systems that belonged in science fiction. The gap wasn't tactical. It was existential. The transformation extended beyond technology to doctrine. The assumption that night, protected movement, held since armies first marched, had been overturned. The belief that dispersal provided safety against air power, partially true in previous wars, had been negated by sensors that detected individual vehicles. The hope that defensive positions could offset offensive technology, the foundation of military planning since the First World War, had proved insufficient when the attacker could see through darkness and strike with precision from beyond retaliation range. Major Rashid al-Tikriti, walking through Baghdad on April 9th, carried with him the memory of that night south of Karbala when his column was destroyed. He remembered the darkness that felt like sanctuary. He remembered the moment the sky lit up orange. He remembered the burning realization that everything he knew about warfare had become obsolete in the seconds it took for a GPS-guided bomb to fall. Years later, in interviews compiled for military studies, al-Tikriti summarized what Iraqi commanders had learned. "We thought we were fighting Americans. We discovered we were fighting the future, and the future doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, doesn't accept brave last stands. It simply arrives, overwhelming and inevitable. We had courage. We had training. We had belief in our cause. None of it mattered. We were analog soldiers in a digital war." The Iraq War of 2003 wasn't the first conflict where technology determined outcomes. But it was the conflict where the integration of sensors, precision guidance, and information networks created a battlefield so one-sided that traditional military resistance became impossible. The nights between March 19th and April 9th, 2003 marked a threshold, the moment when darkness ceased to protect armies and became instead their most dangerous enemy. The Iraqi officers who survived returned to a world where they had become relics. The tactics they knew, the equipment they trusted, the assumptions they held, all had been rendered obsolete by an opponent that could transform night into day, distance into intimacy, and concealment into exposure. They had believed darkness would protect them. They discovered it had become a trap. And in that discovery lay the future of warfare, a future where information dominance, sensor superiority, and precision guidance would matter more than courage, numbers, or defensive positions. A future where the oldest tactical advantage in military history, the cover of darkness, had been permanently eliminated by technology that saw through shadows and struck with mechanical certainty.